Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review this very smudgy device here. It is called the PowKiddy X18S Black Edition. Now this one might look a little bit familiar, and that's because it has several different iterations that have come out in the past. But in a real quick summary, this is an Android-based handheld that has a clamshell design. It also uses the Unisoc T618 chipset found in the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and the Anbernic RG505. Now a very similar device came out a little bit over a year ago, and that one was called just the PowKiddy X18S. And this is a look at it here, and when this first came out I had kind of mixed feelings about it. At the time it was easily the most powerful device under $200, but it also suffered from a number of different hardware issues. Even doing a bunch of mods on this did not completely save it. And you would hope that after a year of working on the device, the revisions and updates for this one here would be a lot better than the previous one. But I gotta say, even on their landing page there are a lot of red flags. To start, they initially called this the PowKiddy X18S Ultra, but I think after the community caught on to the fact that there wasn't a lot Ultra about it, they changed it to just be called the black version instead. And they've also recently reduced the price down from about $175 to $153. Now, according to their website, they've made 5 different updates to it. The first is that they've added the L3 and R3 buttons to their joysticks, and they've also improved the feel of the L1 and R1 shoulder buttons. Additionally, they've made upgrades to the D-pad and the buttons, and they've also removed the PowKiddy lettering to just have a graphic logo instead. And finally, apparently they've done some color matching to give it an elegant atmosphere. And so apparently those are the upgrades you can expect from this device, but even here on their website they do note that you should accept its shortcomings because it's not a perfect product. And so that's what we're going to do in this review today. We're going to see whether or not these upgrades to the device actually do make it worth it. And as you probably figured out from the title of this video, yeah, I'm not really a fan of this device at all. However, I do want to give it its due diligence, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump into it. Okay, to start, let's go back to the PowKiddy website and look at these specs real quick. Like I mentioned before, this has the Unisoc T618 chip, and that's actually a pretty good chipset for this price point. It has 8 cores, and they also have bundled it with 4 gigs of RAM. Additionally, the device has 64 gigabytes of storage, 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5.0, and runs Android 11. This comes with a 5.5-inch 720p touchscreen display with a 16:9 aspect ratio. And finally, it has a 5000 mAh battery, which has given me about 6 hours of gameplay for every charge. Moving over to the unboxing here, I can't really remember what the original box looked like, but this one has a little bit of glitteriness to it, so that's kind of cool. But other than that, it seems to be the exact same standard you would expect from PowKiddy. So you have a USB-C charging cable here, and then some instructions which look to be the same as the previous model. And so now let's get a look at the device itself, and first impressions here, I was actually pretty impressed by the black matte coloring here, but as you saw in the intro, it will pick up smudges instantly. Up top we have the same I/O as before, so a USB-C charging port as well as an HDMI out and then a microSD card. Overall, the design seems to be exactly the same as it was before. And yeah, as you can see right here, after 2 seconds of holding this thing, it's already gotten some smudges on the back. Looking at the bottom here, we have 2 stereo speakers and a headphone jack. And overall, yeah, I would say this still feels like a pretty sturdy system, especially when you have it closed like this. So let's start looking at these supposed upgrades. We'll start with the shoulder and trigger buttons. To me, these feel just as bad as they did with the previous model. So the shoulder buttons themselves have a lot of travel, despite the fact that they are not analog buttons. And then the L2 and R2 trigger buttons have a lot of mush to them. You have to really jam down on them for them to work, and they feel very loose in the case as well. And so overall, these are not pleasant buttons to press down on. And yeah, it was the exact same experience on the original PowKiddy X18S. Not only are these buttons not very pleasant to press down on because they feel so loose and mushy, but when you're actually holding the device and trying to use those buttons, they are extremely uncomfortable. And so yeah, overall, if I had to give a grade to these buttons, I would give them like a 3 out of 10. They are that bad. So in terms of upgrading the shoulder buttons, I'm not seeing it. Let's move on to the inside of the device and see if any of these upgrades are going to be worth it. To start, it looks like the overall design is exactly the same. The colored buttons no longer have a full coloring to them, just the actual lettering themselves. And I will say the feel of the buttons themselves are a little bit better than they were originally. On the previous model, these would bottom out when you press down on them, to the point where they felt like they were going inside of the case when you push down too hard. Now these are still very shallow buttons, but at least they don't go into the case when you press down, so they are an improvement. Unfortunately, however, I cannot say the same about the D-pad. The D-pad here also has very shallow travel, and it will bottom out when you press it down against the case. In addition, it feels like my D-pad is faulty. If I press down on the right button here, it actually will get stuck in place, and the only way I can get it unhinged is to press the left button. And unfortunately, this is a very unpleasant feeling experience, so it feels like there's a piece of plastic that was stuck to the D-pad and needs to be shaved off. But I think even if the right button didn't stick on my D-pad, it would still be a completely unpleasant experience. The D-pad itself is just way too shallow, and there is basically no travel here at all. Now, another component they changed are the analog sticks, and I will say that these are actually an upgrade. They feel a little bit bigger and chunkier than I remember, and they also do now click down for L3 and R3. And so I would say among all of the other upgrades we've tested so far, this one's probably the best. In fact, I feel like they're just about the right exact size that I would want in a clamshell handheld like this. My only complaint here is that the rubber caps feel a little bit too soft, and my worry here is that over time they will start to degrade. Now, the remaining buttons on the device are all soft and clicky, so the select and start buttons here as well as all the function buttons on top. And so these feel a little bit mushy, but they're actually pretty precise given the fact that there's a micro switch underneath. So no huge complaints about these buttons here. In terms of the functions here, we have the volume buttons on the far left, then this G button here is a key mapper, and then we have our power button and then 3 Android function buttons, our menu, home, and back buttons. I've heard a lot of people hoping that this would be a dual screen device to make it really good for Nintendo DS emulation, but unfortunately that's not the case here. And like I mentioned before, they replaced the PowKiddy wording with just this PowKiddy Guy logo. Now on the inside of my old device, I did a bunch of mods. For example, with the face buttons, I added a bunch of scotch tape to make them stick out a little bit more. But I would say the upgraded version of the PowKiddy buttons are actually better than my modded buttons here, and so that one is actually a little bit better. However, with the D-pad, what I did here is I replaced it with an old Nintendo DS D-pad as well as an RG350 rubber membrane, and that combination is still much better than the upgraded one from PowKiddy. Finally, another mod that I did is I added PlayStation Vita sticks inside here to give them a little bit more responsiveness. And I gotta say, I probably like the new analog sticks better because they're nice and chunky and they also click down L3 and R3. And so among all of the mods that I did on my old PowKiddy X18S, the only one that I think is actually better than the new one now is that new D-pad. The other components are actually a little bit better on the new black version. Okay, looking at the screens here, yeah, these seem to be exactly the same as before. The only major difference here is going to be that the bezel is black, and so it just kind of melds into the screen a little bit better. But otherwise, I think they are probably using the same panel. So let's go ahead and power these on and actually get down to business. To start, on my old version of the X18S, I used a custom ROM image from Black Seraph, and that included a bunch of optimizations and fixes to make the device work a lot better. Now, I'm not sure whether or not that custom ROM image is going to work with the black version as well, so we're just going to use the stock firmware in this video here. And so let's do a quick orientation. They're using some sort of custom launcher right here, and it looks like the only things that are pre-installed are some sort of game here and then the Happy Chick app, which will allow you to do emulation right there. Otherwise, it seems to be just your very basic things, but it does come with the Google Play Store. Now, if you'd like, you can go into settings, and then under apps and notifications, you can go into default apps, and then from here, you can change out your home app to the one they call Quick Step. That's going to basically make it work like an Android tablet. So next, I'm going to go into the Google Play Store and download all my apps, and I'll be right back in a minute. And so here I am an hour later, and look at how much this device has transformed after just an hour of setting things up. When I first opened it up, I thought the matte black looked pretty good, but the moment I started touching it, it turned into this kind of germ-infested cesspool. And I don't know enough about plastics to really say what's going on here, but man, they definitely used the wrong plastic for something that's going to be handled all the time. In fact, this is probably one of my biggest deal breakers when it comes to this device overall. And it just kind of amazes me that PowKiddy did not notice that after an hour of use, these devices become disgusting. Or even worse, maybe they knew it was going to be this bad and they just decided to gloss over it anyway. By comparison, here is the old X18S. I've had this for over a year and I've never physically cleaned it, but as you can see, it is not as smudgy as the other one. So the comparison between 1 year of use and 1 hour of use here is just kind of gross. Anyway, in terms of setup, I'm not going to get into details because I've created separate guides for that, but I have an Android emulation guide which will help you get set up with all of your emulators. And then I recently did a video on the Daijisho front end, which gives it this really nice pretty interface that you can use instead of the PowKiddy one. And so that's what I've done here. I've gone ahead and set all of that up, and now I can navigate through all my systems and launch them from here. Before we get into the gaming, one thing I do want to note is that when you close the device, it will go into sleep mode. And I tested it the other day, and after 17 hours of standby, it lost 7% of battery. So on average, it's going to lose about 0.4% an hour. And so we're going to start with Android gaming first, and one thing I want to make note of here is that the controller profile here with an Android does not actually get picked up by most games. And so here, for example, with Diablo Immortal, which does have third-party controller support, it doesn't even recognize it. And so instead, we'll have to press the G button to bring up the key mapper, and then we can assign our buttons to mimic the touchscreen controls. And this works out pretty well for those games that do not have controller support, but it's kind of a waste given the fact that some of these games do have controller support and it doesn't work. Either way, yes, you do have a built-in solution in case the controller support doesn't work, but it is kind of a shame that it doesn't work out of the box. Same thing happened with Grid Autosport. None of the buttons were actually registering, but one thing I did notice is that it did have some sort of gyroscope. And so by shifting the device around, I was able to move the camera a little bit, but it didn't make any rhyme or reason. And so if you were to tilt the device to the right, it doesn't mean that your car is going to turn to the right. It is not properly calibrated. And so in the end, when it comes to Android gaming, yes, you can play some games on here if you use a key mapper, or you happen to get lucky and get a game that does recognize the controller like Horizon Chase Turbo. But at the end of the day, I would say this is not a very good solution when it comes to Android gaming. Another thing you may be interested in, because it is an Android-based device, is game streaming. And I will say I was able to launch the Xbox Game Pass app, and I was able to start up some games using the cloud. The problem is this app does not recognize L2 and R2, so you cannot use those buttons at all. And this was the same problem that happened with the original X18S. And so if you can imagine, yes, I can play Halo 4, but I cannot actually fire a gun. Instead, I'd have to play the whole game throwing grenades, and while that does sound kind of fun and challenging, I don't really want to do that. And so in the end, yes, you can use this for cloud-based gaming, but you'll have to pick and choose which games you can actually play. Something like Shredder's Revenge might be a good idea because then you don't have to worry about having those triggers, but it is kind of a shame that you're not able to play every single game within Game Pass. So now let's actually start talking about retro game emulation. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, this does have a pretty powerful chip. So when it comes to retro games, anything from the 8-bit, 16-bit era, anything else like that, it's all going to play fine. Although bear in mind that you are going to get black bars on the side when it comes to playing anything that's not a 16:9 system. When it comes to something like Game Boy Advance, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you are going to play a lot of games in their original aspect ratio of 4:3, then you are going to have some wasted space. But at the very least, I would say the display is serviceable. The colors seem to be fairly accurate and the saturation is pretty good. So let's start moving up in performance. We'll start with PS1. This one can play at a 2x resolution, absolutely no problem, so this looks really great. And for the most part, arcade games play pretty well. In fact, these games are a pretty good fit for the device because the analog sticks work a lot better than the D-pad. However, if you want to try to play any fighting games with that D-pad, well, good luck. Personally, I got about a 50% success rate just trying to throw a fireball in any of the Capcom games. And so if you do want to play fighting games, I would say that you're better off with the analog stick, and that D-pad is going to be pretty frustrating. But because this device is so powerful, it can play Killer Instinct, which is pretty awesome. Moving up to Nintendo DS, these games can all play just fine, even when you put it at the higher resolution. And so if you're looking for a device to play DS games, yeah, this one works out pretty well. As far as sensitivity of the touchscreen goes, I would say it's pretty good. The panel itself is at least fairly accurate. I didn't feel like I had any missed touches when I was trying to use anything. It's definitely not a touchscreen panel I would want to do a bunch of serious drawing on, but I think that it would be just fine with a Nintendo. But I think it'll perform just fine with something like Nintendo DS in a pinch. Moving on to Nintendo 64, I'm using the standalone Movement 64 Plus emulator, and I upscaled the graphics to 720p to match the resolution of the display. And yeah, this one runs great. Every single game I tried ran at full speed with the default emulation profile. There were some inaccuracies here and there with Killer Instinct and GoldenEye, but otherwise it was playing at full speed. Moving over to Sega Saturn, I kept everything at the original resolution here, and yeah, all the games were playing at full speed as well. This really was no surprise to me because we had the same performance on the original PowKiddy X18S. Moving forward from here, let's do Sega Dreamcast using the Redream emulator with an upscale of 960p. And same story here, every single Dreamcast game played at full speed. Now one thing to bear in mind, Redream is a free emulator, but if you want to upscale the graphics, you do have to pay for an in-app purchase, which I think is about $5. Either way, if you want nice sharp graphics for Dreamcast, I think it's well worth it. Now if you don't want to pay that $5, there is a free app called Flycast which also can do graphical upscaling. On top of that, you could also try it in RetroArch. You'll probably get a little bit worse performance, but you will be able to upscale as well. Either way, long story short, Dreamcast is going to be just fine on this machine regardless of the emulator you choose. Even NBA 2K2, one of the hardest games to emulate, ran at full speed. Okay, next up is Sony PSP. We're going to do a 720p resolution here as well, which is a 3x upscale. And for this one, just about every single game played at full speed. Even some of those ones that are a little bit harder to run, something like Outrun 2006 or Wipeout Pulse, just fine at 3x resolution. But of course, God of War is in a league of its own, but as you can see here at a 2x resolution, it's still playing at full speed. So other than those really high tier games like God of War or Killzone or Resistance, everything else is going to play at 3x resolution. For those games, you're probably going to be best served with a 2x resolution instead. Okay, so that entire generation of systems all play just fine on the T618 chipset. So let's go ahead and push to the systems that don't play as well. We'll start with the Nintendo GameCube. Now for all these games, I'm using the Dolphin MMJR emulator with the native resolution. On top of that, I'm using the European or PAL version of these ROMs, which means they have a frame rate cap of 50 frames per second. That's going to make it easier for them to get to full speed. Now there are other emulators you could use like Dolphin MMJR2, which can do what they call sub-pixel rendering. What that means is you could play games at a lower resolution than the native one. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of that because I think the games look really bad at that point, and so we're going to stick with a 1x resolution and see what we can do. And I would say out of the box, the easier to emulate games, I would say that bottom 25% are going to run no problem whatsoever. In fact, as you start getting up to that 50% mark, there's still going to be a lot of games that play well too. And so games like Mario Kart or Mario Tennis or even Super Mario Sunshine seem to play just fine with a little bit of stuttering here and there. However, once you start pushing it to other games, you may see some dips here and there. Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is a great example. For the most part, this game does play pretty well, but in certain parts, the frame rate's just going to dip dramatically. And so you're going to get a bit of a yo-yo effect, where sometimes it'll run at 100% and then other times it'll drop all the way down to 50. And I don't think that's the end of the world. I would say this game is still pretty playable if you're willing to live with that, but personally I find that kind of yo-yo effect to be kind of frustrating when I'm playing a game. And so that's really going to depend on the game that you're playing and your tolerance of that effect. Now, for the most part, games work best using the Vulkan backend, but sometimes that can create some graphical issues with certain games. For example, with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, you can see it's playing at basically full speed, but there are a lot of graphical glitches happening. However, if we move over to the OpenGL backend, you can see that it is going to have much better graphics, but it is unplayably slow. And so you'll have to experiment with the different graphical backends to find what works best for each game. And of course, I would say the other half of the Nintendo GameCube games are going to have a lot of slowdown, and it's going to really be up to your tolerance level. And so to say that a game like Resident Evil 4 or Metroid Prime are going to be playable really depends on you. Personally, I think these two games are just a little bit too slow to be completely enjoyable. I think I would spend too much time thinking about the fact that I'm getting slowdown than just actually enjoying the game. And then of course, as you start moving up even further in that chain, then when you get to something really hard like F-Zero GX, there's really no hope. Even when trying emulation hacks like a 300% CPU processor speed like on this one, it's still not going to be completely full speed. And so at best, I would say to expect about 50% of GameCube games to play pretty well out of the box with some minor tweaks. And I would say it's a similar story with PlayStation 2. There are going to be some games that you can play without any sort of major tweaks, and they're going to be just fine. That's going to be some of those lower end games like Final Fantasy X or Crash Bandicoot or Kingdom Hearts. For the most part, these games are going to play at full speed. However, after you get past that first 10 or 20%, you will get a lot of slowdown. Tekken 5 is a great example. Here I'm using the fast preset but with no underclocking, and I'm getting about 60, maybe 55% of full game speed. So if we go into the menu here and we click the settings toggle here, go into system settings, we have two different underclocking options that we can set. I'm going to set these for 75% and moderate underclocking. And what that's going to do is it's going to slow down the PS2 processor speed so that it can play at a 100% speed. But depending on the game that you play, this may also slow down gameplay. And so here we are with a moderate underclocking with Tekken 5, and yes, the stats actually say that it's running at 100% speed. But you can clearly see that the characters are running just as slow as they were before. So unfortunately, even with those tweaks, I wouldn't say that Tekken 5 is playable. However, there will be some games that work well with this setting. For example, Grand Theft Auto 3 looks pretty good, and same thing with Simpsons Road Rage. So it is going to require you to do some experimentation to find the best setting per game. And even then, it's not going to be a miracle worker, it'll really depend on the game. And so I would say maybe 40-45% of PS2 games are going to be playable with at least a moderate underclocking. Some games may actually work with the full frame rate if you do a maximum underclocking, like here with God of War, but it is going to cause other issues like jittery gameplay. And much like with GameCube, you will get better results if you try the PAL version of these ROMs as well. Okay, so last emulated system here is going to be the Nintendo Switch using the Skyline emulator. And this one's actually pretty easy to set up. I did a dedicated video about it a couple months back. And I would say overall I tested about 15 games, and among those about 5 of them would actually boot. And of course the ones that boot are going to be the very lightweight games. So something like Sonic Mania or Tiny Barbarian or even Celeste played at a pretty good frame rate. However, other games that I did expect to play pretty well because they do on other systems were unplayably slow. So for example, SteamWorld Dig 2 and Bastion both were unplayable. And so at the very least, I would say that there's maybe a half dozen Switch games that you could play on this device without any problem. But I would expect more often than not that it's just not going to work. Okay, that's really about it when it comes to testing, so let's move over to the summary and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the PowKiddy X18S. In terms of what I still like this T618 chipset. We're definitely going to see a lot more of this in the future when it comes to the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and the Anbernic RG505. But I think that performance at this price point is pretty good. I love the fact that I can upscale PSP and Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 and every game plays great. PS2 and GameCube are a little bit of a hit and miss, but honestly those weren't even really a factor this time last year. And so it does go to show that emulation optimization has improved greatly even in the last year. I also think the battery life is pretty good on this. I would expect about 6 hours of battery life altogether. And I know there's a lot of people out there who do like clamshells, and so that is one bonus. And as far as devices under $200 go, this is definitely the most powerful one in a clamshell form factor. But really, that's about all the good things I can say about this black version here. So now let's take some time and talk about what I don't like about it and why you probably shouldn't consider this for a purchase. Number one is the smudgy plastic. I am really just dumbfounded that PowKiddy decided this would be a good idea. In fact, my opinion on the device completely soured when I saw how ugly it got just after an hour of gameplay. So if anything, if PowKiddy does watch this video, I hope they never use this plastic again. Additionally, I think overall we just have some really poor buttons. I know they tried to make some upgrades here and there, but honestly it's not that much of an improvement. At the end of the day, this is just a very uncomfortable device to hold and play. The triggers and shoulders are hard to access, and it feels just very flat. I think in my original review video, I likened it to playing a grilled cheese sandwich, and that still applies here. Additionally, I don't like the fact that the controller profile doesn't work well with most Android games. And so it's the little things that really start to bother me. The fact that I can't use the L2 and R2 buttons when I'm doing game streaming, or the L3 and R3 buttons don't work in the PlayStation 2 emulator, things like that. I just find it disappointing that PowKiddy had this device for over a year with all the complaints that everyone had, and all of the upgrades that they made are superficial at best. And finally, the last point here is that it really doesn't make sense to consider this device at all. Given the fact that Anbernic and Retroid are releasing handhelds in the next couple weeks that have the same chipset, and they're at around the same price, I really don't think that anybody is going to find the X18S to be a worthy competitor. The unfortunate truth here is that PowKiddy had a 1-year head start on the competition here, and they botched the entire process. After all, like I said in my original X18S review, what good is a device and all the power inside if it's not something you'd actually want to play? And so the combination of the smudginess here and the minimal improvements here means this is not a recommendation from me for a future device. But it was nice to get a little bit of a head start to test this chipset before the other nicer devices start releasing. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. It's not often that I'm negative about a device here, and yeah, I really wanted to like this in the first place. But unfortunately, I think that PowKiddy sold themselves short by not making any major upgrades to this device, and I think they're doing you as the customer a disservice in that regard. But there may be something really nice about this device that I completely missed, so let me know in the comments if you think there's something else. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.